Thank you so much, Tadush. It's an honor to be here. It's something of a tease. Of course, it would be nice to actually visit the National Library, especially since it keeps snowing here in New York. And it's not supposed to do that on Purim. So it would be nice to be in Jerusalem. But hopefully soon. Okay, so with your permission, I will share my screen and we will get going. Okay, to set the stage, I want to think for a bit with you about what Jews expected, what Jews believed or tacitly accepted in the early days of the Second Temple of Bayit Sheni. And there are a number of elements to what Jews seem to have shared in common as to what they believed. They're living in exile, scattered throughout the Babylonian Empire, which was then taken over and became the Persian Empire. And yet they held on to certain beliefs. And I'm not going to argue these in a lot of detail, but my construction of this list comes from the text that we have from early Bayit Sheni, from the Second Temple period. And that's some of the Nevi'im, some of the prophets like Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi. It's from some of the narrative books like Ezra and Nehemiah, books like Daniel, and also hints in other books like Chronicles, Divrei Yamim, and even some later books that are not in the Bible that allow us to reconstruct what Jews thought during the time period. So there are a few things that Jews seem to have assumed. One, they took for granted that the dynasty of King David would be forever the legitimate heir to the monarchy of Israel. Two, especially in exile, perhaps, they took the value of endogamy, of in marriage, marrying another member of the Jewish community, as an important principle in Jewish culture, community, and continuity. Three, especially in the exile, they looked forward to a new exodus, to there being a repeat or maybe even improvement over the exodus from Egypt, over Yetziat Mitzrayim from whatever number of centuries ago. And they looked forward to their exile ending in a similar, and again, maybe even superior experience of an exodus from Babylonia. They also thought a lot about what it meant to be a Jew. Was it a matter of practice? We know we have evidence from naming practices that people continue to have Hebrew names. We have evidence for the observance of Shabbat, question of food practices. All of these things defined who was and who was not a Jew. But in this case, I would not argue that there was unanimity. Probably there was a lot of discussion over what counted as a Jew in exile. Things that were unanimously assumed, the last two things were the centrality of Jerusalem and the centrality, ubiquity, activity of God. Now, all of this is in the background because what I want to see with you in the next 40 minutes or so is an argument in two parts. The first part is that the book of Esther, the Hebrew book of Esther, the Megillat Esther as we have it, is unconventional in a lot of ways, including on all of these points, all these very central points of Jewish thought and identity in Bayit Sheni times and times of Second Temple. And so that's the first argument. The second argument is that some Jews were so disturbed by these observations about the book of Esther that they corrected it, they improved it and gave us a different version of the book of Esther. So that's what I'm going to try to look at with you in the next 40 minutes or so. So here's our brief overview of what we'll see in the story of Esther. Dynasty of King David, Esther says, no, the heroes here are from the tribe of Benjamin. In fact, from the dynasty or maybe from the family of Saul, the first king, David's great rival. We'll look at that in a little bit more detail in a moment. Endogamy, well, come on. I mean, Esther is literally intermarried. She is married to the king of Persia. A new exodus? Well, in Esther, the redemption, the Geulah, takes place on Passover, but they don't go anywhere. There's no exodus whatsoever. Exodus literally a going out. There is no going out. They sit at home in Shushan and as a later commentator says, Akate avdei da Achashverosh anan. We are still slaves to Achashverosh at the end of the story. There has been no change in our situation. Who is a Jew? Well, Mordechai is a Jew. Mordechai ha-Yehudi. But he has no connection to Yehuda. He has no connection to the tribe of Judah, no connection to the land of Judah, no connection to Jerusalem. And so Esther seems to have a very expansive sense of who is a Jew, literally a Yehudi, in introducing Mordechai as a Yehudi. Jerusalem, we'll have a little bit of time, I hope, for this in a few minutes, has been replaced literarily by Shushan Habirah, by the city of Susa, the fortress of Susa, as the center of the world, as the place where everything happens. And as for God, well, maybe the most important and certainly I think the most famous literary aspect of the book of Esther is that there is no God. God simply does not appear in the book of Esther. And that is, even though we learned that early on when studying the book of Esther, I think we interpret Esther badly when we take our eye off that. In other words, it's so important, it's so obvious, and yet it's so important to think of how radical this is, that the story of Esther is told entirely without mention of God. Not during the story, not after the story, nowhere does anyone invoke God. So that's something that we will, again, hopefully turn to soon in a little bit more detail. Okay, so I'm going to spend just a few minutes trying to step through some of these to support these points, to try to argue that these are not just my chart here, but that in fact, Esther is radical in all of these ways. And then, as I said, in the second part, we'll turn to how people responded to this. Now, why do I say that there's a comparison to Saul? Well, it's explicit in the book of Esther when Mordechai and then Esther are introduced. This is in chapter 2, verses 5 through 7, essentially. We hear Ish Yehudi haya b'Shushan Habirah ushmo Mordechai ben Yair ben Shim'i ben Kish Ish Yemini. So we're told he is a Ish Yehudi. I don't have a better word than a Jewish man. You could say Judean, but since he's not Judean, that seems to be a wrong translation. A Jewish man was in the fortress of Susa, and his name was Mordechai, the son of Yair, the son of Shim'i, the son of Kish, a Benjaminite, an Ish Yemini. And then we're told, Asher hogla Yerushalayim, im hagola asher hoglata, im Yechonya melech Yehuda, asher hegla Nebuchadnezzar melech Bavel. This is the one and only mention of Jerusalem in the book of Esther. And we're told that he who was exiled from Jerusalem with the exile, which was exiled with Yehoiachin, the king of Judah. This is the pre-destruction exile back in 597 BCE. I won't belabor that point right now, which Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had exiled. Now, who was exiled from Jerusalem? So some readers take the referent of who was exiled to be Mordechai himself. But second thought about the history tells us that doesn't make a lot of sense. The exile of Yehoiachin, let's say, was in 597 BCE. The destruction of the temple was in 586 BCE. Achashverosh, who in English is called Xerxes, comes to the throne in 485 BCE. And since we're now hanging out in the 7th year of Achashverosh in the story here in chapter 2, that puts us in roughly 478 BCE. So the exile was about 120 years ago. So it's not likely that it's Mordechai who was exiled. It's likely, in fact, that it's his great-grandfather who was exiled. So the sentence should be read, Mordechai, son of Yair, son of Shimi, son of Kish, a Benjaminite who was exiled from Jerusalem. And Mordechai is now a 4th-generation diaspora Jew. And that's clear in his name, right? You notice that Kish is a Hebrew name. We'll come back to that name in a second. Shim'i is a Hebrew name. Yair is a Hebrew name, but Mordechai is a nice Babylonian name. So 4th generation, that's what you expect, right? They're not giving Hebrew names anymore. But more centrally for our point, this introduction is very similar to the introduction of Saul himself back in the book of Samuel, where we read, this is in chapter 9 of 1 Samuel of Shmuel Aleph, Vahi Ishmi Binyamin Ushmo Kish ben Aviel ben Seror ben Bechorat ben Afiach ben Ish Yemini Gibor Chayil. So this is the original Kish. And really interestingly, so structurally, you hear already there was a man, son of, son of, son of, son of, son of. But also interestingly, in Esther, of course, we don't need to know about Mordechai right now. He's not the character we need to know about. The character we need to know about is Esther. But first we're told about Mordechai, and then in verse 7, the verse that I didn't read yet, Vayhi omein et Hadassah hi Esther. He was raising or training Hadassah, she is Esther. Those names are really interesting, but I'll put them aside for now. And just note that in Esther, we're introduced to this sort of quote unquote wrong character first. We're introduced to Mordechai and told he was raising Esther. Esther's the one, of course, who's going to be called to the palace. That's structurally the same as what we got in Saul. First, we were introduced to Kish. There was a man from Benjamin, his name was Kish. Velo hayave nishmo Shaul bachur batov. And he had a son named Shaul, chosen, choice, and good. Now, this is really just the beginning of a whole series of comparisons between the characters in Esther and Mordechai, and Saul. Starts with the names. So Kish, Mordechai's great-grandfather, is also the name of Saul's father. I assume that these are different people, centuries apart, but the names certainly ring a bell. The structure of the introduction also says, oh, you know what? I remember this. This is reminiscent of the story of Saul. And then I'm going to run through this, but there's a whole series of further evocations of Saul as we read through the Megillah. So Esther, of course, does not tell her origin. Ein Esther magedet moladata. In the book of Samuel, we had read Dvar HaMelucha lo higilo, the matter of the kingship, he did not tell him. But then, more importantly, I think when it comes to the content, Saul lost his kingship for failing to destroy Agag, the king of the Amalekites, and Mordechai and Esther succeed by defeating Haman, the Agagi, the Agagite. I have no better suggestion, no better interpretation for what an Agagi is, other than a descendant of Agag, the king of Amalek back in Saul's day. One of Saul's, you can read along with me, one of Saul's early mistakes was his failure to act decisively, and instead he remained silent. Macharish, and Mordechai tells Esther, you must not macharish, you must not remain silent. Then you will be destroyed. You have to not remain silent, sort of correcting the mistake that Saul committed. There are specific verbal allusions that link the two stories. So I'm going to just look at the second one here on the slide in front of you. In the story in Shmuel Aleph, Perek Kaf, Shaul hosts a feast on one day, and then another feast the next day. The first one, nothing exciting happens, but the second one, Shaul becomes enraged at his guest, who happens to be his son, Yonatan, for betraying him and protecting David. And Yonatan says, kalta hara'a me'imo. And literally, the evil was completed from him, which means idiomatically that Shaul has definitely concluded that he intends evil. And so Yonatan rises from the feast. Vayakom Yonatan me'ima shulchan b'chori af. Same plot elements exist in the book of Esther. The queen hosts two banquets, successive days. The first one passes uneventfully. The second one, the king rises angrily and leaves. And Haman says, Kira'aki kalta ilav hara'a me'ita melech. Same phrase, kalta ilav hara'a. The king definitely intends evil against him. So the point is that the author of Esther certainly wants us to remember the story of Shaul, the story of King Saul, as we're reading this book. There are all these verbal allusions throughout the Megillah that clue us in that we should be thinking of Saul as the antecedent, as the predecessor of Mordechai and Esther. Last ones, Shaul found revach, relief, by relying on David. Mordechai tells Esther that she must bring revach v'hatzalah. And whereas Saul made the mistake of bringing back the spoils of war from Amalek, in the story of Esther, the Jews do not touch the spoils in Perek Tet, even though they were given permission. So this is, I think, well known. People talk about these comparisons a lot, and I think they're really very important and very obvious, which is a good thing. I think what's sort of sometimes less appreciated is how radical it is in in the Second Temple and Bayit Sheni history to suddenly be talking about characters who sound a lot like Shaul. Shaul hasn't been the king since about the year 1000. Here we are more than 500 years later. Why are Mordechai and Esther being compared to Shaul? So, of course, I don't know. I'm not going to pretend that I know the full answer to that question. But I think one significance to that is in the simple fact that Shaul is not David. In other words, what Esther is doing is setting up heroes who are not from the Davidic dynasty, and in fact are from and evoke David's great rival. They are Shaul heroes, not David heroes. So the book of Esther refuses to give us an heir to the Davidic dynasty as the heroes, and instead gives us sort of an anti-David. Now, one other one that I think is worth dwelling on for a couple of minutes is the expectations for a new Yetziat Mitzrayim, a new Exodus. And this is all over the prophets, Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu, and Ishayahu, Isaiah, the second half of Isaiah, which is by a different prophet, not by the original Isaiah, Yechezkel. They all say, there's going to be a new Exodus. So maybe most dramatic is Jeremiah's, Yirmiyahu. In Perek Tet Zayin says, "L'chein hinei yamim ba'im ne'um Hashem." Days are coming, says God. V'lo ye'amer od chai Hashem asher ha'elat b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim. No one anymore will invoke God and say, "Oh, by the life of God, who brought the Israelites out of the land of Egypt." Just that's what God is known as doing. No one's going to say that anymore. It's going to be overshadowed. Instead, people will say, "Ki'im." Chai Hashem asher ha'elat b'nei Yisrael me'eretz tzafon mikol ha'aratzot asher hidicham shama v'shivotzim al admatam asher natati lavotam. In other words, people are just going to say, God, who's God? God is the one who brought the Israelites out of the northern lands, what Jeremiah calls Babylonia, and from all of the lands which God scattered the people, and God will return, and God had returned them to their land, which God gave to their ancestors. So in other words, what Jeremiah says is that the Exodus is going to be entirely overshadowed by the future redemption, the redemption that he's looking forward to at the end of the Babylonian exile. So Jeremiah says, look, you're going into exile. There's no way around that. But I'm telling you, the end of that exile is going to make the Exodus from Egypt look like child's play. Like no one's going to even remember the Exodus from Egypt anymore. Instead, everyone's going to talk about this new grand Exodus from Babylonia. And since after Purim comes Pesach, so we're probably all thinking about Pesach as well, texts like this are certainly in the background of the debate in the Haggadah, which is not only in the Haggadah, but in the Haggadah, as to whether the Exodus will be talked about in the Messianic age. Right? Is it going to be overshadowed? Okay, but in its historical context, Yirmiyahu says, Exodus, that's from the old days. No one's going to talk about that anymore. We're going to have something bigger and better to talk about when God took the Jews out of the Babylonian exile. It's also in Yechezkel, as I mentioned, in Ezekiel. I'm not going to read this one out loud. And maybe a really interesting one in Isaiah 51, Yeshayahu Nun Aleph, where the prophet calls on God to do exactly that. So, okay, God, I know what you're capable of doing. Let's see you do it now. Uri livshi oz zeroa Hashem. Uri ki mekedem dorot olamim. So, okay, wake up, God. Wake up, O arm of the Lord. Wake up like in the days of old, like in the generations long gone. Why do I think you're capable of great things? Well, hello, atia machzevet Rahav mecholela tanin. Wasn't it you who hacked Rahav into pieces? This is clearly something mythological, a story that we don't have in the Torah, but a story that presumably Israelites told about God in the early days. Something that we do have in the Torah. Pasuk Yud, hello, atia machrevet yam meitehom rabbah. Was it not you who dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep? Hasama ma'amakei yam derech la'avor geulim. Wasn't it you who made the depths of the sea into a path for those who had just been redeemed to cross through? So, okay, you did that. Do it again. So, do it again. Let those liberated by God return. Come to Zion with shouting, eternal joy on their heads. let them have happiness and joy, and agony and groaning will have fled. So again, all the prophets are looking forward to the end of the exile in terms that they get from the Exodus. So you're the one who split the sea, do it again. Now bring them through the desert. Okay, what about in Esther? Well, if I asked you, what's what reference is there to Passover in Megillat Esther? I think probably many of you would say intuitively that there is none, and that would be correct. There is no reference to Passover, to Pesach in Megillat Esther, and yet obliquely there is, because all of the important events of the Megillah take place on Pesach, and the timeline is actually pretty explicit. There's a little bit of ambiguity, like give or take a day, but the basic point is very clear. So Haman, after he gets upset, he calls these scribes in at the end of chapter 3, at the end of Perek Gimel. Vayikaru sofrei hamelech b'chodesh harishon b'shlosha asar yom bo. So on the 13th day of the first month, in other words, on the 13th day of Nisan, the scribes are called in, and they write the letters to all the satraps and governors authorizing genocide. Okay, that's the 13th day of Nisan. What happened after that? Well, the next chapter, Mordecai hears all that happened. He goes to Esther, not quite to Esther. They have their conversation. And at the end of the chapter, the end of Perek Daled, V'tomer Esther lahashiv al Mordechai, lech knos et kol haYehudim hanitzim b'Shushan, v'tzumu alai v'al techlu v'al tishtu shloshet yamim. 3 days. Now, I don't know exactly what day it is. So is it still the 13th day of Adar? I don't see any reason why not, but it could conceivably be the next day. It doesn't really matter that much. I'm just going to go with the short timeline for heuristic purposes. So let's assume it's still the 13th day of Adar. So Esther says, go fast for 3 days. So what are these 3 days? Presumably the next 3 days. So they're fasting on the 14th day of Nisan, the 15th day of Nisan, the 16th day of Nisan. And in fact, there's a number of midrashim that have Mordechai responding to Esther and saying, Esther, we can't fast 3 days because it's Pesach. The table's already set, the kitchen's already koshered. A lot of work's gone into this. There's no way we're going to fast the next 3 days and give up on Pesach. And in the midrash, Esther actually responds. She says, Mordechai, you're an idiot. What kind of zaken b'Yisrael are you? What kind of leader of the Jews are you? Do you not understand that if we don't fast this year on Pesach, there will never be another Pesach? So better to fast this year on Pesach and not have Pesach, and that way we'll have Pesach for years to come. In any event, there was no Pesach that year in Shushan. In fact, on the third day, maybe the 15th, maybe the 16th day of Adar, so the third day is when Esther comes and she invites the king, of course, to the banquet, which takes place that day, and then the next banquet the next day. So this is taking place on the 16th or the 15th of Adar. Next day would be the 16th or the 17th of Adar. I'm sorry, I wrote Adar on all of these. My mistake. I really apologize. I should probably fix that. This is all Nisan. Oh dear. Okay, hopefully that's clear to you. You're probably all screaming at the screen. So I apologize for that. This is all Nisan. So the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th of Nisan. PowerPoints. Okay, so there was no Pesach that year in Shushan because everyone was fasting during the Seder and the next day, and then Esther's banquet takes place the day after that, maybe on the 15th day of Nisan, maybe on the 16th day of Nisan. I'm afraid I'm going to open the chat at the end and find 17 people writing to me that I meant Nisan and not Adar, but all right. If you didn't write it yet, but we're meaning to, you don't have to. Okay, in any event, so what is this about though? Is it just a coincidence? I suspect it's not just a coincidence. I suspect that the book of Esther is telling us that we should stop waiting around for another Exodus. That Passover, was a one-time thing. That was back then. God took the Israelites out of Egypt. That was a long time ago. Here now in the Babylonian diaspora, which has now become the Persian diaspora, there's no more Passover happening. Does that mean there's no more redemption? No. There is a redemption. But the redemption is a very different kind of redemption. It takes place at the same time on the 15th day of Nisan, let's say. Again, give or take a day, but it takes place on the 15th day of Nisan, but it's entirely humanly orchestrated. There is no God in the text. There's no God who's shown up. There's certainly no miracles. Nothing has happened here to make us think of the Exodus. So if Jeremiah said, oh, the days are coming when no one's going to say anymore, God who took the Israelites out of Egypt, instead he's going to say, people will say, God who took the Israelites out of Babylonia. No, it hasn't happened. First of all, God hasn't shown up. And second of all, the Jews aren't out of Babylonia. They're still here at the end of the Megillah. And the Megillah might be saying, look, that's exactly what you have in exile. Like, this is diaspora living. Welcome to it. We have no God. We have no great expectations of the world changing next generation or in 2 years. No, we assume that we will go on living here. And is that depressing? A little bit. But does that mean we have nothing to celebrate? No, absolutely not. Look, let me tell you a story about Esther and Mordechai and how they saved the Jews. Is it a little bit anticlimactic? Because at the end, Mordechai is just Mishneh HaMelech. He's just the vizier of Achashverosh. They haven't left. They haven't gone anywhere. So it is. That's true. But such is life as we know it. I'm going to just make one last point here. And that's that when we read some of the descriptions of Shushan, especially in the first chapter of Esther, things like this, some of these words are new in the Bible, but many of them are not. And if you look at, for example, where do we have tchelet and butz and argaman all together? The answer is really that in the Hebrew Bible, there's only a couple of places where this kind of combination of material shows up. In Esther chapter 1, in describing the court at Susa, at Shushan, and in descriptions of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and the Beit HaMikdash. And commentators have realized this for a long time. This is from an old commentary by Lewis Patton, who wrote, the author has in mind the structure of the tabernacle in Exodus 26 to 27. In other words, when we read chapter 1 of Esther, it's evoking for us the temple, but of course, it's been displaced. It's now over here in Shushan. All right, I'll leave this aside. Okay. Now, I don't want to argue really that this is, that Esther is in fact a dramatically radical book trying to subvert all of these different beliefs. I don't know actually what the author meant to do. There are different possibilities. The author may have meant to satirize Jews who thought these things. Certainly that's one way that it's been interpreted in modern days. Perhaps the author had other things in mind. I don't know that the author thought these were all legitimate moves. Maybe the author thought that this is to lament that this is the only kind of redemption we have is one without God where we don't move. It's very hard to know the authorial intent, and I'm not going to speculate on it right now. What I will say is that lots of readers have reacted and said, there are deep problems here. Like, this is not the kind of book we can get behind. So let me give you one quick example from relatively modern times. It's modern, but relatively recent times, of readers who looked at the book and said, this is not our kind of book. So this is from, you can see here, this is a booklet published by Beitar in Warsaw, 1937. Beitar, of course, the somewhat militant Zionist group. This is pre-war. And the title actually is really the most interesting thing of this whole booklet. This is from the National Library. And I have to thank my colleague, Professor Yael Zerubbabel, who dug it up some decades ago, and we discussed together, actually also some decades ago, but fewer decades ago. In any event, so the pamphlet's called Shnei Moadim, 2 holidays. Yud Aleph Adar, the 11th day of Adar, Semel HaYahadut HaMechudeshet, the symbol, the 11th day of Adar, the symbol of the rejuvenated new Judaism. Purim, Semel HaYahadut HaGalutit. But Purim, 3 days later, the 14th of Adar, the symbol of diaspora, exilic Judaism. What is the 11th day of Adar? Well, that's the anniversary of the fall of Tel Chai, where Trumpeldor was wounded and fatally. And that is the symbol, so of course for Beitar this is quite central, and that's the symbol of the new Judaism, the Judaism where we fight to the death to defend our political sovereignty and our autonomy. Purim, that's the symbol of diaspora Judaism, of exilic Judaism, where we make every compromise possible just to survive. We intermarry, we don't keep kosher, we have Babylonian names. This is not good Judaism. So there's no question, of course, on which side of this dichotomy the Beitar Israel Epstein, who you see edited this, was on. But I want to use this as just an example of the way people have responded to Purim and to the story of Esther as a story of too much compromise, of giving up too much, of conceding that Jewish life is centered in the diaspora and not in the land of Israel. Now, other Jews in antiquity also had similar reactions, and that's what we'll see now in the second, somewhat shorter part. The evidence for this comes from a number of places, but primarily what we'll spend our time on is the Greek version of the book of Esther. Now, what do I mean the Greek version? Well, you can see this in English, of course. The end of it is on the screen in front of you in English. All you have to do is open up a Catholic Bible, or if you can Google something like Greek additions to the book of Esther, and you'll find the text online. But by Greek version, I really mean the version of the Bible, the version of the book of Esther in our particular case, that was the Christian version of the text until the Protestant Reformation. So, for the first 1,500 years or so of Christianity, if you opened the Christian Bible and looked at the book of Esther, as you'll see in a second, it would have looked significantly different. Luther took the additional parts of Esther out, so now it's a Catholic thing, not a Protestant thing. But in any event, this is an old version. But the most important thing to say is that it's not a Christian version of the book of Esther. It's a Jewish version of the book of Esther. It like many things in the Christian scriptures, especially in the quote unquote Old Testament part of that, even if it's different from what we have in the Hebrew Bible and Tanakh, it still goes back to Jewish sources and Jewish authors. In this case, we actually have a colophon, a little addition at the end of the text that tells us where it came from, or at least it gives us an accounting of where it came from. And this is how the text ends. In the 4th year of the reign of Ptolemy and Cleopatra, Dositheus, who said he was a priest and a Levite, and his son Ptolemy brought the above letter about Purim, which they said was authentic. Lysimachus, son of Ptolemy of Jerusalem, translated it. And what seems fairly certain is that this is being brought. You see that Dositheus and Ptolemy brought the letter. They brought it from Jerusalem, where it was translated, from Hebrew into Greek, to Alexandria, where there is a massive Jewish community, which overall was illiterate in Hebrew and engaged even with Kitvei HaKodesh, even with Tanakh, in Greek. Now, when is this exactly? So historians did some work to try to figure out, which Ptolemy, which Cleopatra, there are so many of them. And, so it turns out this is Ptolemy the 12th, who was married to Cleopatra the 5th. And the 4th year of Ptolemy and Cleopatra gives us about, since Ptolemy comes to the throne in 80, so 77, 76 BCE. Now, it's coming from Jerusalem to Alexandria. What's going on in Jerusalem in, let's say, 76 BCE? Well, it turns out that's a year of transition of power, but not from dynasty to dynasty, just from monarch to monarch within the Hasmonean dynasty. So Alexander Yanai, Jannaeus, happens to die in 76 BCE, and Shlom Tzion Hamalka, Salome Alexandra, then comes to the throne. As it turns out, this is towards the end of the Hasmonean dynasty. Of course, they didn't know that at the time. And towards the end doesn't matter for our purposes. We're in Hasmonean Jerusalem. So the Chashmonaim, the story of Hanukkah took place back in 164 BCE, so 90 years earlier. The Hasmoneans have been ruling more or less since then, not as monarchs from the beginning, but eventually as official monarchs. And that already, I think, provokes us to ask, wait a second, that's an interesting question. So I showed you a few minutes ago what Beitar Zionists would think about the story of Esther. What would Chashmonaim think about the story of Esther? And I think you don't have to think too hard about that to realize that in all sorts of ways, Chashmonaim would not like the story of Esther. What do we know about the Chashmonaim's ideology? Well, first of all, it's all about the temple and God. Right, so this is the beginning of the book of 2 Maccabees. Since we're about to celebrate the festival of rededication of Hanukkah, we're writing you, God has saved all his people, restored to all of us our holy land, the kingship, the priesthood, the temple services, just as he promised in his law. He has rescued us from terrible evils, purified the temple. We're confident that in his mercy, he will soon gather us to his holy temple from every nation under the sun. So this is sort of core to what the Chashmonaim fought for, lived for, how they lived and breathed Judaism. A book that is set in Shushan Abirah, that suggests that Shushan has replaced the Mikdash in some way, that doesn't have room for God, that doesn't mention the Beit HaMikdash at all, even though at the time of Esther, the Beit HaMikdash is standing, doesn't mention the Torah at all. All of these things would have been anathema to the Chashmonaim. Also, very presumably problematic for the Chashmonaim, is Esther's choice to marry the king. Now, much has been made of whether Esther wanted to be queen, didn't want to be queen, was taken forcibly. But of course, the Chashmonaim may have pointed out that there's always a choice. Like, what do you mean taken forcibly? So you mean that it was at the threat of your life? Okay. You know what we do when we are threatened with death, and given the choice to die or to violate the law? We die. And in fact, the very first stories of martyrdom in Jewish history, of people actually dying rather than violating the law, are in the books of Maccabees. So the horrible story in 2 Maccabees 6 about the old man named Elazar who chose to die and gave a speech about it rather than eat pork. So Elazar dies, you see in verse 31, but his courageous death was remembered as a glorious example, not only by young people, but by the entire nation as well. And then the next story, the very next chapter in the book of 2nd Maccabees is the even more horrifying story of the Jewish mother and her 7 sons who chose to die rather than violating the law. And I think by the end of chapter 7, almost all readers agree with the narrator when he says, but I've had it said enough about the Jews being tortured. But this is central to the way Chashmonaim told their story. They picked up a sword and were willing to die rather than violate any laws. What kind of story is Esther, where she goes, whatever her mindset was, but still she goes to marry the king, live in sin. What is she eating in the palace? What is she doing on Shabbat in the palace? Who's she sleeping with in the palace? Like all of these things. This is not acceptable for the Chashmonaim. So some of the big problems with Esther: absence of God, centrality of the Mikdash in Yerushalayim, the lack of resistance in the name of religion. All of these things would have bothered, I think, any Jew who had an ideology somewhat like that of the Chashmonaim. So what do you do with the text that bothers you? Well, you have a number of options. You can ignore it, and some Jews certainly ignored the book of Esther. You can fight against it, or you can fix it. And what we have in the Greek Esther is an attempt to fix it. So the most striking thing about the Greek version of the book of Esther is that there are 6 additional chunks of text throughout the book. Now, these are just conventionally labeled A through F. A is the very beginning of the book. So if you open the book of Esther in a Catholic Bible, the beginning will seem different to you. It doesn't start. It was in the days of Achashverosh. Instead, we get a prequel, so to speak, which gets Mordecai on the stage right at the beginning in the very first chapter. I'll look at that in a second. And it ends with edition F, which links to edition A. Then there's two additions, which are the texts of the letter sent by Haman in chapter 3, authorizing genocide, and the letter sent later on in the book by Mordecai and Esther, authorizing the Jews to fight back. In the Greek edition, we have the actual text of the letters. I mean, I say that as if they're authentic. We have texts of the letters recorded in the book. And then in the middle, editions C and D we'll come to in a minute. So very, very briefly, I'll encourage you to read these in more detail because they're really quite fascinating. But very briefly, edition A. So you open the book, and in the Greek version, this is what you get. Again, I should just emphasize, the Greek version was not originally Greek, right? If you go back to the Colophon, we were told it was translated by Lysimachus, son of Ptolemy of Jerusalem, which certainly implies that the text itself at least claims that it was originally in Hebrew. And I see no reason to doubt that, actually. I assume that these additions were originally in Hebrew and then translated into Greek. We call it the Greek version because we have it in Greek. But the most important thing, I'm tempted to really call it the Hasmonean version of Esther. But in any event, if you open up this version, the Greek/Hasmonean version of Esther, the book starts as follows. In the 2nd year of the reign of Achashverosh the Great, on the 1st day of Nisan, Mordechai, son of Yair, son of Shimi, son of Kish, had a dream. And his dream was, 2 great dragons come forward, ready to fight. At their roaring, every nation prepared for war. A day of darkness and gloom. The world is threatened, but then there came from a tiny spring came a great river with abundant light. Light came, the sun rose, and the lowly were exalted. And so right off the bat, we meet Mordecai. Mordecai saw in this dream, continues this, what God had determined to do. And after he awoke, he had it on his mind, seeking all day to understand it in every detail. So when we meet Mordecai in this version of the story, two things are centered that are actually entirely absent in the book of Esther as we have it in the Hebrew, in the Jewish version, today's Jewish version. One, Mordecai is given a prophetic dream. So he's like a character like Yosef. Right? He's like, the first thing we meet about him is he has a dream that tells us the future. Two, what we're going to find out is that the whole book is a plan orchestrated by God. So this dream is going to tell us the basic template of what's to come, which doesn't only tell us something about Mordecai, it also tells us something about God's involvement in the story. That means that Mordecai is a religious figure like Joseph, and the story is a divine plan, like Joseph's story. Now, at the very end of the book, Mordecai says, now I understand. These things have come from God, because the dream was there from the beginning. The river is Esther, the two dragons are Haman and myself, and so on. So in other words, the entire book is seen retroactively, but not only retroactively, also proactively, as being a divine plan. So this is one way in which the book is improved. Even more dramatic, I think, is what happens in the middle of the book. In what's between what we have as chapter 4 and 5. So in between the conversation between Mordechai and Esther in chapter 4, in Perek Daled, which ends with Esther telling Mordechai, Lech knos et kol haYudim, vayavor Mordechai, vayasef kol asher tzivta alav Esther. And then the next verse, the next line in the Hebrew version is, the third day, Esther goes in. In between those, we have large chunks of additional text in the Greek / Hasmonean version. And these are Mordechai's prayer and Esther's prayer. So the first one, Mordechai's prayer, I won't read out loud. I think the most important thing is actually just the fact that Mordechai prays. Of course, this again, recenters God and makes Mordecai into a much more overtly religious character than he is in the Hebrew text as we have it. But Esther's prayer is, I think, even more interesting. Esther, seized with deadly anxiety, fled to the Lord. And she gives a long, impassioned prayer, which goes back to history and says, I know all about you, God. I know what you've done. I know our covenantal history between God and the Jews. And I know what you're capable of. And you know all about me. You know, I'm skipping here to verse 15. You have knowledge of all things. You know that I hate the splendor of the wicked and abhor the bed of the uncircumcised of any alien. You know my necessity, that I abhor the sign of my proud position, which is upon my head on days when I appear in public. In other words, the crown. I abhor it like a filthy rag. I don't wear it on days when I'm at leisure. I don't eat at Haman's table. I've never honored the king's feast or drunk the wine. I have been actually miserable since I have been brought to the palace, except when I find you, O Lord, God of Abraham. Save me from my fear. So this is the correction to Esther's character that was needed, right? If we were wondering, Esther, why didn't you put up a fight? Why didn't you say something? Why do you just give in to whatever the Persians say? Well, we don't get a full answer for why, but we do get the sense that she has a tormented soul about this. She knows that this is terrible. She admits that it's horrific, and she lives with that guilt every day. And she minimizes it to the extent possible. But she had to do it for whatever reason. And so she just prays to save me from my fear. Now, when she goes in the Greek version, she faints. And this is a scene that's been portrayed by many, many artists. Esther fainting in front of Achashverosh. This one's Tintoretto, a very busy scene. There's a lot to say about all of these scenes, but I'm going to, unfortunately, just show them to you briefly. Veronese, Venetian in the 16th century, Esther, who's apparently fainting, although not nearly as dramatically, Guercino, and my personal favorite, maybe because it's in the Metropolitan Museum, but I think it's also arresting in its bareness of the details, Artemisia Gentileschi, who painted Esther with just her two attendants fainting in front of a very youthful looking Achashverosh. This scene of Esther fainting is in this Greek / Hasmonean version, I don't know if that's ideologically significant. It may just be a dramatic addition to the narrative, meant to bring Esther in line with other Hellenistic stories, Hellenistic romances, where a woman would faint. But certainly some of the artists take it as more than that, and take it as an example of Esther manipulating the king, sort of fake fainting in order to evoke his compassion and his sense of protectionship. But in any event, the most important point really is that there is this different version of the Book of Esther, because what we have here is a version of the Book of Esther that's been not just translated into a different language, but vastly improved upon if your ideology revolts against the original version of the book. In other words, if you are offended by the fact that there's no God in the book, and there's no miracles in the book, and the characters are only dubiously religious in the book, well, here's the version of the book of Esther that you'll find more to your taste. Here's a version that apologizes for the breaches in the law, where Mordecai is explicitly given divine inspiration of a dream that tells him what's to come in the story. And therefore, also, we hear that the entire thing is, in fact, a divine plan. This whole thing has been designed by God and was meant to unfold just in the way it did. So why is Mordecai the way he is? Why is Esther the way she is? Well, that's all part of the divine plan. It's like asking, why is Joseph in Egypt? Of course they have to be in Egypt. Of course Joseph has to be in Egypt because he has to save his brothers. Why is Esther in the palace? Of course she has to be in the palace. She is put there. In the Megillah, in the Hebrew version, all we have is a question. Who knows? Mi yodea im la'it kazot higat lamalchut. Maybe this is why you're the queen. In the Greek version, this is emphatically affirmed right from the very beginning. God has orchestrated this whole thing to make sure that Esther is in the right place at the right time, and Mordecai is the conduit for that divine knowledge. So what does this mean? It means that back in antiquity, the Book of Esther was a divisive book, probably to some extent falling along political or ideological lines, where Jews who may have lived in the diaspora said, like, hey, this is exactly the book that's familiar to us. This is the book that tells of our story. The vicissitudes, the uncertainty of living as diaspora Jews here in the exile without overt miracles, as opposed to Jews like the Hashmonaim, whose life was centered on the Beit HaMikdash, centered on Yerushalayim, who had no room in their worldview for a book that did not center the temple in Jerusalem in the narrative. And so what we wind up having is, in fact, two versions of the story. The Hebrew version, which leaves all of these improvements out, and the Greek version, which, I'll put in quotation marks, but I don't mean this cynically, improves the story by including all of these new additions. A whole another follow-up question would be like, well, why is the old version, the one that has all these flaws, the one that we actually still have in the Bible? In other words, why did the new improved Hasmonean version not get into the Bible? And that, I think, is a really important and interesting question. It's unanswerable in a short form because we don't know how anything got into the Bible. And so it's hard to know when and where that, in fact, took place. But certainly that's one question that results from this. I won't leave you with any more answers, only with some information and hopefully some more questions. And I'll end with just thanks to Professor Michal Bar-Sher-Sigal and to Tadeusz Walensky for arranging all of this. And with the wish, as the Megillah says, La Yehudim Hayta Ura v'Simcha v'Sason V'Ikar, as we add in Havdalah every week, Kein Tiyeh Lanu, so may it be to us, the same light and happiness and rejoicing celebration that the Jews had at the end of the story of Esther. And of course, today we have to wish this more fervently than ever, and not only to us, but to the whole world, that we should have such peace and rejoicing.
Thank you very much, Aaron, for this fascinating lecture. And yes, we do have a few questions, so I will read them to you, and you are more than welcome to answer. So actually, the first question was asked by Sandy. Question about Vashti, as relates to all of the above. It was at the very beginning of your presentation. Is she really less important, though recently there has been some reconsideration? And if she's more important, what about the endogamy issue?
Yeah, it's a great question. Vashti, as you say, has often been relegated to just sort of a bit part in our thinking about the story. That is obviously just a mistaken analysis. The author chose to tell us this whole backstory about the former queen, which was unnecessary for the sort of strict plot of the rest of the book. You could have just picked up the story and said, once upon a time there was a king looking for a queen, and let's get into Esther. We don't need to know why there was no queen right now. So clearly Vashti sets the stage in some way. There are, I think, not mutually exclusive, a number of different things that the Vashti scene tells us at the very beginning of the book. Some of that relates to the role of the queen, so the constraints under which Esther is operating. Some of which relates to the ways in which you can and cannot oppose or resist Persian authority in the story. So Vashti, who simply says no, gets banished. So that tells us up front, okay, that's not going to be a productive way of operating here. We need to have more interesting and subversive ways of dealing with power if we're going to use that power. So you can't oppose the power; you need to use that power to your own benefit. But there's more to say about Vashti that I think paying attention to her and thinking about her is well worthwhile. And as Sandy indicated, for a long time, and this goes back to rabbinic times, Vashti was sort of relegated to just another offensive character. And I think the resuscitation of her as a positive character in a broad sense, in the sense that she is resisting the authority of the king, who is trying to do something offensive and inappropriate, is a good turn. I think we appreciate what the author was doing with Vashti more when we understand that Vashti is resisting something that the king should never have been asking for. But there's a lot more to say about that I'll leave aside because it's not so central to this discussion, but I think is absolutely really central for thinking about Esther more generally.
I was muted, I'm sorry, thank you. And I guess also Sandy would thank you. Another question from Jeffrey. One critical analysis of Esther contends that it is, in fact, the fusion of two separate stories. What is your view? References to Saul, the Haftorah for Parshat Zachor on the Shabbat before Purim tells the story of Saul and his rejection by Samuel.
Yeah, great point, Jeffrey. I don't see a lot of evidence for the sort of dividing Esther into two separate stories, as some people have tried to do in the manner of source criticism. I think it is true that just narratively, the last two chapters, really 9 and 10, which 10 is only three psukim long. So basically chapter 9 sort of goes off the rails in some narrative ways. It's a very different style, the language is different, it's very repetitive. The first, most of the book is really very tightly narrated. There's very, very little extraneous detail. Action moves very quickly. Chapter 9 is like very plotting. It's unclear what's happening at certain points. They keep doing the same thing over and over again. So I think it's possible that there's some literary history question that explains why chapter 9 is different from the first 8 chapters. But on the whole, again, I think going into a lot of detail would take us a little too far afield. But on the contrary, I think that the different strands of the narrative throughout the Megillah, in other words, for example, the fact that Mordecai and Haman have a personal fight, and the fact that the Jews and Haman have a national fight, those two are independent in terms of the plot, and yet intertwined really quite brilliantly by the author, so that we sort of feel them together, even though they're sort of technically separable. So I think there's a lot to say about them, but other than chapter 9, I don't see a lot of evidence for there being a literary prehistory in the first, in the bulk of the Megillah.
Okay, lovely, thank you. And another one from Gilon, Isaiah, why is God in the feminine, and are there other similar references?
Right, so that's such a great question. So there's sort of a technical answer, and then and I think as you're gesturing towards, Gillian, a larger answer. So the technical answer is that the prophet there is addressing Zroa Hashem, the arm of God. And like all other evenly paired body parts in Hebrew and elsewhere in Semitic, arms are feminine. So that's why we have, for example, the Yad Chazakah and Zroa Nituya in the Exodus story. Those are feminine adjectives, the strong hand and the outstretched arm. So that's the technical answer. But since you ask about similar references, I think it would be irresponsible, and I think we'd be missing a great opportunity to say to not follow up on that a little bit and say that there is limited amount of this in the Bible, but a lot of it in later Jewish thought that in fact does dwell on the feminine aspects of God. There's a wonderful book on the historical front of this by Tikva Frimmer-Kensky, who's a biblical scholar who unfortunately died too young, who points out, and her big argument is that when you go from a polytheistic society with gods and goddesses, in other words, male and female gods, to a monotheistic society, you have to figure out what to do with all those female aspects of the goddesses that are now unclear where they live. And she argues that to some extent, that's why there are a lot of female characters in biblical narratives, but also why there are a lot of feminine aspects to God in the Bible. So God, for example, is nursing the Israelites in Numbers 11. And again, as I said, it's limited in the Bible. It's picked up a lot in later Jewish thought, especially in Kabbalah, where you have the Shekhinah, which is explicitly feminine, again, grammatically, but also thematically. And the uniting of the male and female is actually central to Kabbalistic thought. So Gilead, I'm probably not the best person to step through that whole story, but I think your question is attuned to a really important question there. The gender of God it's mostly a grammatical thing rather than a theological thing. This is in the Bible, it's taken for granted that God is masculine, but don't confuse that with a strong statement that God is male. In fact, most of the biblical authors would have been offended if you said, like, so what does that mean? What kind of genitalia does God have? Like, that would have been clearly the wrong question to ask, and in fact, quite offensive. So you're noticing the feminine aspects, I think, is a really important step towards thinking about that more deeply.
Okay, that's very nice answer. Thank you, and bringing us closer to our times indeed. Okay, Alexander actually asked, referring to mistake between Adar and Nisan. He's asking, would be interesting to know why Purim is now on 14-15 Adar if the original events were set on 14-15 Nisan?
Yeah, it's a great question. Again, there's sort of a technical answer, and then I think a more broadly thematic answer. So very briefly, the technical answer is that according to the book itself, the Purim celebrates not the dramatic events that allowed for the redemption to take place, in other words, Esther's banquets, but the actual fighting. And that took place on the 13th of Adar. And so the celebration was the next day on the 14th of Adar, or one day later in Shushan. But it's also, I think, really significant to ask, at least, well, what do people think about the sort of the organization of the Jewish calendar in this way? And the dates are not just technicalities; they also structure the Jewish calendar. And I think it's fair to say, certainly if you're thinking of Nisan as the first month, that the calendar we now have then starts with Pesach on the 15th day of Nisan. That is, we start the year with this story of a grand redemption where God steps in and does all sorts of, the most miraculous things that we hear about ever in Jewish history. And we end the year, as the very last month of the year is closed by Purim, exactly 30 days before Pesach. And it ends with a very different kind of redemption. It ends with a redemption, again, a diasporic redemption, a redemption where no one ever moves anywhere. This is the epitome of that Jewish joke that holidays are, they tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat. The only one that's really true about is Purim itself. That's really true about Purim. There is nothing to celebrate on Purim other than the fact that Jews are still alive at the end of the book. Nothing else happens. There's no guarantee that this will last any more than one generation. And yet, that's what we celebrate. So, and in fact, the rabbinic law in the Mishnah says that it has to be exactly 30 days apart. If there's like a leap year, like our year this year, Purim has to be in the second Adar in order to make sure that it's exactly 1 month before Pesach. So the linking of Purim and Pesach is not trivial, even though, as I said, there's also a technical answer to why it's an Adar.
Okay, thank you. Very not only technical, but very right one, accurate one. Okay, actually, there were also two questions, very similar from Carol and Rebecca about Hashmonaim. The Hashmonaim, by the end of the dynasty, were not particularly observant of the Torah. So is this still true by Solomon that they wouldn't like Esther? Like this is the reason.
Really good question. Yeah, it's a very good question. And of course, we don't have, unfortunately, ideological treatises from the late Hashmonaim, so it's hard to be certain. But when when people say that they're not that observant, I don't know if I would sign on to that as it's formulated. Certainly, the rabbis don't like their observance. They have turned to become at least affiliated with, maybe explicitly, Tzduki, Sadducees. So they're not to the Pharisees' liking, to the Prushim's liking, and then to the later rabbis' liking. And clearly they've made missteps in all sorts of ways. But I wouldn't say that they are not observant. And in fact, they seem to be entirely centered on the Mikdash and on Jerusalem and things of that sort. I don't see any reason to think that they wouldn't be in these core issues, like their ancestors, in agreeing that a book that doesn't have Jerusalem, doesn't have God, and has essentially no religion, it would be a problematic book. It's really interesting to think whether Shlom Tzion, I'm not going to pretend, even if the translation was made in 76 BCE and Shlom Tzion is already on the throne, let's not pretend that Shlom Tzion is the translator, right? So, the ideology of the monarch is not necessarily exactly the ideology of the people in Jerusalem at the time. It would have been influential, but it's certainly interesting to think, like, did Shlom Tzion herself think of Esther in positive ways, like, well, at least we have a woman in the Bible. I mean, this is like, at least there's something here to commend her for. Or on the contrary, did she think, like, this is ridiculous? Like, what kind of book is this? If we're going to have a Jewish queen, let it not be someone like Esther, who is malleable and weak and only succeeds by manipulating the men. Let's have someone like me. Like, why is there no biblical book like me? Like a woman who actually rules. And I think that's, I have no idea what Shlom Tzion thought, but it certainly would be interesting to hear her thoughts on it.
Okay, thank you as well. There were actually another two similar questions about like links between Christian Catholic scholars and the Book of Esther. Vivian was actually wondering what have scholars made out of the book. And second, similar in a way question is why actually the painters were so much excited about Esther's story, especially Dutch painters, because usually those paintings were commissioned by aristocracy or church. And there is even one in Sixtine Chapel. So maybe do you know the reasons why actually this was so popular?
Really good questions. The second one, I don't know of a broad answer for that. I mean, there's all of these painters. Well, let me take Gentileschi. So Gentileschi has a series of biblical scenes. She also has a series of specifically women in biblical scenes. All of which are really remarkable. So she spends a huge canvas on Judith decapitating Holofernes. Judith is actually an interesting story in thinking about Esther as well. There's a lot of similarities, but a lot of ideological differences. But in the case of Artemisia, for example, in Gentileschi, the answer may have something to do with her own interests and what kind of stories attracted her. I'd say that for many of these artists, these are not commissions. This is not like the 15th century in Florence. This is not, the Duke telling you what to paint. This is a different cultural world where they're actually painting the things that are resonant to them and then hoping to find the market. And of course, people like Rembrandt and Gentileschi, picture actually on the cover of my book, which is on the flyer for this event, was by Jan Levens, another Dutch painter who was a sort of a Talmid Chaver, a friend of Rembrandt, who, if we had a little bit more time, I think made some interesting choices in painting Esther in a different way. But I don't know that there's a broad answer for why lots of artists were interested in Esther. They're interested in drama, they're interested in the Bible, and those certainly meet in the story of Esther. But I don't know, I guess the first question would be just whether there's actually quantitatively more about Esther than about other dramatic scenes in the Bible. I don't know if that's true, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure how to address that question, but it's a great question, and I wish I had a broader sense of the interest in, let's say, the 16th, 17th century to think about, and it's both North and South, right? It's Dutch and Italy, to think about like what they're seeing in it. I don't know if there's a single broad answer to that question, but it's a really interesting question, and I'll maybe do a little bit more research on that.
We will try to look for a Dutch scholar who maybe
for sure
was researching that, and generally about the like scholar connection between Catholic thought and the Book of Esther. That was actually the first part.
Well, people have written about the fact that for many centuries, Christians were very uncomfortable with the Book of Esther, actually. This is, goes back to the church fathers. And this has something to do with, even though it's not a very religious book, it's a very nationalistic book, not in the sense of a land and autonomy, but at the end, the Jews fight against the, either depending on how people read it. Many of the readers read it as Jews against the Gentiles. Careful reading says, no, it's not Jews against Gentiles, it's Jews against those who hate the Jews. But still, the idea that Jews were militantly picking up swords and actually killing 75,500 people at the end of the book disturbed a lot of people. Say, oh, this is not what Jews are supposed to do, disturb Jews as well. And there's, there've been Jewish reactions. There's also, okay, I'll leave it at that. But Luther has some terrible things to say about the Book of Esther. It's the most Jewish and most despicable of all books. There's a lot. There's a long history of Christian animosity towards the Book of Esther, which I don't want to claim was always homogeneous. In the Middle Ages, you do find Christian voices here and there saying positive things about it, or at least aspects of the book. But on the whole, Christians actually didn't like the book. It was something that they had to live with because it was in the Bible, but uncomfortably. And even today, there's been some really interesting theological pieces by Christian theologians struggling with, like, what do we do with a book like this? Like, how is this going to feed into the gospel, the universal mission of the church? It doesn't really seem to lead in that direction. And so what do we do with this kind of book? And it's been a struggle, which I think is also interesting, not only because of the history of the struggle itself, but also because of what it tells us about the book. And it does make people uncomfortable in different ways, depending, again, on what do you expect to find in a biblical book. If you expect to find a book that prepares us for the universal throne of God, this is not your book. So if that's what you're looking for in the Bible, you're going to have trouble here. And again, that trouble leads to struggle and reinterpretation and all sorts of interesting grappling with a tough text.
Okay. Lovely. Another question we had from Joseph. If Esther has a Hebrew name, Hadass, why doesn't Mordechai?
This is a wonderful question. First of all, I don't know if Mordecai doesn't have a Hebrew name. Of course, I assume you mean this as a literary question. We're told that Esther has a Hebrew name, but we're never told that Mordecai does. So first, on the Esther side, that's a great point, because I think the first question is actually, why are we even bothered? Why does the author bother to tell us that she has a Hebrew name? We never hear that Hebrew name again. There's no mention of Hadassah after we're told Hadassah, she is Esther, and then she's Esther for the rest of the book. So why bother to tell us that she's Hadassah? I think it's very likely that that's the whole point, that the whole point is that for the rest of the book, she will not be Hadassah. She is given no opportunity to be her Jewish self. She is going to be Esther, and then Esther Hamalka. And at the end, she's even, in a really remarkable turn of phrase, Esther Hamalka bat Avichail. So Queen Esther, daughter of Abichail, which is the first time her father's name has been mentioned since chapter 2, but she's still never allowed to come back to be Hadassah, like her Jewish self. So the names, I say that first to just emphasize the names, the choice of names is certainly important and deliberate. Why does Mordechai not have one? It's a great question. The author may be saying, in my impression, I think interpretation is too strong a word here, but my impression is that the author is saying that Mordechai is actually acculturated from the beginning. He doesn't have this big dilemma of am I Hadassah, am I Esther? He's Mordechai. That's clear to him. He's Yoshev B'Shar HaMelech. He works in the king's court. He's clearly a member of the Persian bureaucracy. And so he's emphatically Mordechai. I've been tempted actually to write a kid's book about the backstory of Mordechai and Esther, how Esther came to be raised by Mordechai. So Esther's parents must have died. In my imaginary story, Esther's parents were quite pious, more rural Jews who gave her a good Hebrew name, whereas Mordechai had been raised in Shushan, in the big city, and emphatically had a Persian identity and name. And so when Esther's parents died, when she was a young adolescent and she had to move in with her big cousin Mordechai, who was already like 22, first thing he did was say, listen, you can't be Hadassah here in the capital. In the big city, you can't have a Jewish name. You got to have a Persian name. So we're going to rebrand you Esther. So I don't know what the answer is, but I think you're absolutely right that the naming is significant and I think tips us off to something about their identity.
Okay, lovely. Another, and I guess it will be the last question, but the question is in 1.14, is that advisor name the Hindu Krishna?
Is the advisor?
I just send you can read it. I just forward you. Do you see chat? Maybe you will understand it better.
Yes. I assume the reference is to the advisor whose name is Karshana. So the question is that a reference? I guess the question is that a reference to the Hindu god Krishna? My inclination is to say probably not, but the Persian Empire was a huge cosmopolitan place. And as the very first line, we're told that the Persians ruled from Hodu, which is essentially the Indus River Valley, and what's now Pakistan or even northwestern India, all the way to southern Egypt, to Sudan, to Kush. So it is entirely possible that there are people from all sorts of ethnic backgrounds who are in the Persian capital of Shushan. So I wouldn't rule out there being Hindu or Indian, more broadly, Indic influences or names in Shushan. I don't know if people have made that connection. It's an interesting idea, but it's a great indication of the cosmopolitanism of the Persian Empire, which is in fact drawing from, as the book says, 127 different provinces, numerous languages and cultures. So I don't know, but I guess kind of anything's possible in Shushan in a way that probably wasn't true in any other prior capital. It is an amazing melting pot in that sense.
Okay, great. Actually, if we are around India's time, okay. So the last question, and we'll finish. Here, Irv is asking: are there other faiths other than Christianity and Judaism that connect to the Purim story?
That's an interesting question. So there are echoes of it probably echoes of it in the Quran. Haman shows up in the Quran, but in really weird, surprising contexts. There's actually a book relatively recently by a colleague at the Yeshiva University, so I guess your neighbor, Tadush, Adam Silverstein, called something like Esther in Islamic Lands or something like that. Where he tries to sort of dig through, like, what do we have in Arabic literature that still relates to the book of Esther. It's basically in the Jewish and Christian Bibles. That's certainly the primary point of departure for anyone who's engaged with Esther, is in those religious traditions.
Okay, thank you. Aaron, it was really great to host you here. Thank you very much for a really wonderful lecture. Except of many questions, we had also a lot of great comments. Thank you for this wonderful lecture and so on and so forth. I can send you this later so you will see by yourself. So thank you, great hosting you again, and probably see you in future. And Purim Sameach to all of you.
Purim Sameach, and I would look forward to it.
Okay, bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all for coming this evening or afternoon.